Power abused without cause always reveals truth. I heard the crack before I saw his face, a sharp brittle sound that did not belong on a quiet Los Angeles street at 3 in the afternoon, and for a split second my mind tried to place it somewhere harmless, maybe construction, maybe a loose sign, anything but the truth sitting right in front of me, my red Ferrari trembling under my hands as sunlight shattered across the windshield in fractured lines. Each glint catching the edge of something that felt personal, deliberate, wrong. I turned slowly because I have trained myself to move slowly when everything inside me wants to react, and there he was, Officer Daniel Hayes, standing beside the car like he owned the air around it, baton still in his grip, posture rigid with certainty, his eyes scanning me not with curiosity but with conclusion, like the story had already been written before I ever opened the door. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, calm, controlled, practiced, the kind of voice that does not expect to be questioned. And I felt it then, that familiar tightening in my chest, not fear, not exactly, something older than that, something I have carried through boardrooms, through airports, through every place where silence was safer than correction. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the heat, asphalt radiating through the soles of my shoes, every movement measured, every breath counted. I could feel people watching, phones lifting, eyes narrowing. Not because of the car, not really, but because of me. Standing next to it, a black woman in a tailored suit beside a machine worth more than most houses on this block, I kept my voice steady, softer than the moment deserved. "You are damaging federal property," I said, not raising it, not challenging him, just placing the truth gently into the space between us, and he smiled, not wide, not friendly, just enough to show dismissal, the kind of smile that says you have already been sorted into a category he understands. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," he replied, each word clipped, deliberate, and I noticed the way his grip tightened slightly on the baton, not threatening, not aggressive, just firm. Enough to remind me where authority stood in this exchange. I raised my hands slightly, palms open, not in surrender but in clarity, in patience, because I have learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not react when the world expects you to break. The air felt heavier then, like the street itself was holding its breath, and somewhere behind me a car slowed, someone whispered, someone laughed quietly. The sound carrying just enough to reach me. I did not turn, I did not look, I focused on the details, the reflection of the sky across the fractured glass, the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the rhythm of my own breathing staying even despite the tension building around me, because I knew something they did not, something I could not say yet. Not because I was afraid, but because timing matters, truth matters more when it arrives at the exact moment it cannot be ignored. Hayes stepped closer. Close enough that I could see the fine lines at the edge of his eyes. The certainty etched into his posture. "License and registration," he said, and I nodded once, slow, deliberate, reaching into my jacket with care, aware of every movement, every assumption being made in real time, and I thought, not for the first time, how quickly perception becomes reality when no one pauses to ask, how easily authority becomes something else when it is never questioned. I handed him the documents without a word, and as his eyes dropped to the name, just for a second, just long enough to create a crack in that certainty, I felt the shift begin, subtle, almost invisible, but real, like the first ripple before a wave, and I stayed still, grounded, composed, because I knew what was coming. And I knew it would not need force, only truth, and if this moment touches something in you, stay with me, because sometimes the quietest moments carry the loudest kind of justice. I watched his eyes move across the paper, slow at first, then sharper, like something in the letters did not sit right with the story he had already decided about me, and for a moment the street noise seemed to fade into a low hum, the kind that fills the background when your mind is trying to catch up with something it did not expect. His jaw tightened slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, I always see it, that small fracture in certainty when reality does not match assumption, and still he did not look up, not yet, as if keeping his eyes on the page might give him time to hold on to control. "Ava Brooks," he read under his breath, testing the name like it might reveal more if he said it out loud, and I stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands still visible, not moving, not rushing him, Because this moment was not about proving anything, it was about letting the truth surface on its own terms. A car passed behind him, tires rolling slowly over the asphalt, and someone across the street whispered something I could not quite catch, but I did not need to. I had heard enough versions of that tone in my life to know what it carried: doubt, curiosity, quiet judgment. Hayes flipped the page once, then again, his fingers pausing just a fraction longer than before, and when he finally lifted his head, the look in his eyes had changed, not completely, not enough to erase the authority in his posture, but enough to show that something had shifted beneath it. "Step over here," he said, gesturing toward the curb, his voice still controlled but missing the sharp edge it had a minute ago. I walked where he pointed, each step steady, deliberate, aware of the distance between us, aware of the space he still believed he controlled. The heat pressed against my back as I stopped, sunlight reflecting off the broken glass behind me in scattered fragments, and I could feel the weight of the moment stretching, tightening, like a wire pulled too far. He keyed his radio then, pressing the button with his thumb. "Dispatch, run a verification on this license," he said, tone neutral, professional, but there was something underneath it now, something cautious. The silence that followed was brief but heavy, the kind that makes every second feel longer than it is, and I let my gaze drift just slightly past him, not away, not avoiding, just enough to take in the scene around us, the half-circle of onlookers, the phone still raised, the car sitting behind him with its damaged glass catching the sun in fractured light, a symbol of something larger than the moment itself. I thought about how quickly things escalate when no one pauses, how easily a situation becomes something else entirely when assumptions lead the way, and I felt that familiar steadiness settle deeper into my chest, the one I had built over years of being underestimated, overlooked, misread. It was not anger. It was not even frustration, it was clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are when the world decides it already knows. The radio crackled softly in his hand, a voice beginning to respond on the other end, and I saw his grip tighten just a little, his attention snapping fully back to the device, his posture still firm but no longer unshakable, and I realized then that the moment had already turned, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. In the space between what he believed and what was about to be confirmed, and I remained exactly where I was, grounded, composed, letting the truth move forward without me forcing it, because sometimes the strongest position you can hold is the one where you do not have to prove anything at all. The radio did not answer right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like the world itself was holding a breath it was not ready to release. Officer Hayes shifted his weight slightly, his stance still firm but no longer rooted in the same unshaken confidence. His eyes flicked from the device in his hand back to me, then away again, as if looking directly at me now required more certainty than he currently had. "Dispatch, confirm status," he repeated this time, with a tighter edge beneath the professionalism, and I could hear it, not fear, not yet, but pressure, the kind that builds when control starts to slip in ways you cannot fully explain. I stood there in the heat, the air thick against my skin, aware of every small movement around us, a car door closing somewhere behind the crowd, the faint buzz of a phone camera adjusting focus, the quiet shuffle of someone stepping closer to see better. And still I did not move, I did not speak, because this was no longer about my voice, it was about what was about to come through that radio, something official, something undeniable, something that would not care about perception or assumption. Hayes ran a hand briefly along his jaw, a gesture so quick it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I saw it, that need to ground himself, to regain a sense of control before the answer arrived. "Ma'am, why are you operating this vehicle under federal registration?" he asked, his tone measured but searching now, and I met his gaze fully. For the first time since he had stepped out of his cruiser, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "Because it is assigned to me," I said, simple, direct, nothing more, nothing less, and that seemed to land somewhere deeper than anything I had said before. His brows pulled together slightly, not in anger but in calculation, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer fit together cleanly. The radio crackled then, sharp and sudden, cutting through the tension, like a line drawn across the moment. Unit 12, this is dispatch, stand by for verification. The voice came through steady, official, and Hayes straightened instinctively, his attention snapping fully to the device. Go ahead, he replied, and I could hear it now, the shift in his voice, still controlled, still professional, but carrying a weight it had not held before. The crowd behind him grew quieter, as if even they sensed something was changing, something they could not yet name. The sunlight caught again on the shattered edge of my windshield, scattering light across the pavement in broken reflections, and I thought about how quickly a moment can fracture, how easily a situation built on assumption can begin to fall apart once truth enters the space. License confirmed. Dispatch continued, a brief pause following, just long enough to let the first piece settle. Hayes did not speak, he did not move, he just listened, and I watched the tension in his shoulders hold steady. Waiting for what came next, because I knew there was more, there always was. Truth rarely arrives in a single sentence, it unfolds, it reveals itself piece by piece, and as the radio remained open in his hand, as the air around us tightened again in anticipation, I felt that quiet certainty settle even deeper inside me. The kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that simply waits, because it knows exactly what is about to be said. The radio did not finish right away, and that pause felt heavier than anything that had come before it, like the space between two truths that could not exist at the same time. Officer Hayes remained still, but I could see the shift moving through him now, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that starts in the mind and slowly makes its way into the body. Unit 12, be advised. Dispatch continued, the voice steady, almost routine, but carrying a weight that did not match the ordinary rhythm of street calls. The registered individual is flagged under federal clearance. There was another pause, shorter this time, but sharper, like the edge of something final, and I watched his fingers tighten slightly around the radio, his knuckles paling just enough to catch the light, his shoulders no longer squared in the same absolute certainty they held minutes ago. Repeat, federal clearance. Dispatch added, and that word seemed to settle into the space between us like a quiet echo. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Hayes swallowed once, barely noticeable, but I saw it. I saw everything now, because the moment had shifted from control to realization, from assumption to consequence. He turned his head just slightly, glancing toward the car again, toward the fractured glass reflecting the afternoon sun in scattered fragments, and for the first time since this began, he looked at the damage not as evidence of authority, but as something that might carry meaning beyond his decision. Clarify clearance level, he said into the radio, his voice still composed but no longer untouched, and I stood there, still grounded, still silent, letting the conversation unfold without interruption, because this was not about proving a point, it was about allowing the truth to reveal itself fully. The air around us felt different now, not quieter, but more focused, like every sound had sharpened, every movement slowed just enough to be noticed. Someone in the crowd shifted their stance, another lowered their phone slightly, unsure of what they were witnessing now that the narrative had begun to change. The radio responded again, this time without hesitation. Federal Bureau of Investigation, active status, do not detain. And that was it, no dramatic tone, no raised voice, just a statement, clean and direct, but it landed with a weight that could not be measured in volume. Hayes did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the device in his hand as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar if he waited long enough. But they did not, they stayed exactly as they were, clear, final, undeniable. I watched the realization move across his face, not in a sudden reaction, but in a slow, controlled adjustment, like someone recalibrating their understanding in real time. His posture shifted again. Less rigid now, less anchored in that earlier certainty. And when he finally looked up at me, the difference was there, not just in his expression, but in the space he allowed between us, a fraction more distance, a fraction less assumption. He lowered the radio slowly, his hand no longer as firm as it had been, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the street around us holding that silence like it mattered, like it meant something beyond the moment itself. I could feel the eyes of the crowd still on us, waiting, watching, trying to understand how something so certain had begun to unravel so quietly, and I remained exactly where I was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present, because this was the moment where everything could be said without words, where truth had already done the work, where authority no longer needed to be challenged because it had already been redefined. Hayes exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries more than just air, and for the first time since this began. His voice when it came was different, not weaker, not unsure but aware. "Agent Brooks," he said, and hearing my name spoken that way, without dismissal, without assumption, felt less like a victory and more like a correction, a realignment of something that should have been clear from the start, and still, I did not respond immediately, because some moments are not meant to be rushed, some moments require space to settle, to be fully understood before anything else is added, and as the sunlight continued to reflect across the broken surface of the car behind him, as the city moved quietly around us, I stood there in that space between what had been assumed and what had been revealed, knowing that the real shift had already happened, and that nothing he said next would change the truth that had just been spoken. The air did not move the same way anymore after he said my name, and I could feel it in the way the street held itself, like something invisible had shifted direction and everyone was quietly trying to understand what had just happened. Officer Hayes stood there with that word still lingering between us, agent, not spoken with authority, not even with confidence, but with the careful weight of someone stepping into unfamiliar ground, and I let that silence breathe for a moment, because sometimes recognition is not in the words themselves but in how they are carried. I looked at him then, fully, not as the man who had stepped toward my car minutes ago with certainty in every movement, but as someone now standing inside a reality he had not expected to face. "Yes," I said simply, my voice even, calm, unchanged, and that seemed to settle something deeper in him, not resolution, not relief, but awareness, the kind that does not arrive all at once but builds quietly, piece by piece. He nodded once, almost to himself, like he was acknowledging more than just my response, like he was replaying the last few minutes in his mind and seeing them from a different angle, one he could not ignore now. His gaze shifted briefly toward the car again, toward the fractured glass that caught the sunlight in uneven reflections, and I saw it then, not guilt exactly, but recognition. A realization that what had been done could not be undone by a simple correction of tone. The moment had already happened, it had already left its mark, and no adjustment in posture or voice could erase that. "I was not aware of your status," he said carefully, choosing each word with more attention than before, and I listened without interrupting, not because I needed the explanation, but because this was part of the process. This was what happened when assumption met truth and had to find a way to exist beside it. "You did not ask," I replied, not harsh, not accusatory, just clear, and the simplicity of it seemed to land heavier than anything else, because it pointed to something beyond this moment, something larger, something that had nothing to do with paperwork or clearance levels. He inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again, and I could see the shift continuing. Not outwardly dramatic, but internal, the kind that changes how a person stands in their own authority. Around us the street began to move again, slowly, cautiously, like a scene resuming after an unexpected pause. A car rolled past at a reduced speed. Someone across the way lowered their phone completely now, unsure of what story they had just witnessed, unsure of how to frame it, and I remained where I was, steady, grounded, letting the moment settle without rushing it forward, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, it was about allowing what had been revealed to exist fully in the open. Hayes shifted his stance again, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just adjusting, as if finding a new balance in a situation that no longer fit his initial understanding. "Is there anything you require at this time?" he asked, the words formal, procedural, but carried with a different tone now, one that acknowledged rather than assumed, and I considered that question for a brief moment, not because I needed something from him, but because I understood the weight of what had just taken place. I glanced once more at the car, at the broken lines of glass catching the light, then back at him. "Just awareness," I said, and the words settled into the space between us with a quiet finality, not as a demand, not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as something that would remain long after this moment ended. He nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he understood that what had happened here was not about a single interaction, but about something deeper that could not be corrected in a single exchange. And as the city sound gradually returned to its normal rhythm, as the tension eased into something quieter, something more reflective, I stood there knowing that the real shift had already taken place, not in the badge, not in the car, but in the space where assumption had been replaced with something else, something more honest. Something that could not be ignored once seen, and if this moment resonates with you, remember that true strength is not in proving who you are, but in standing still long enough for the truth to be seen. The word awareness did not fade when I said it. It stayed there, suspended between us like something neither of us could step around, and for a moment Officer Hayes did not respond, not because he did not hear me, but because he was still catching up to what that word meant in a moment like this, not policy, not protocol, but something quieter and harder to measure. Something that cannot be written into a report or filed away after the shift ends. He looked at me again, really looked this time. Not scanning, not assessing, just seeing. And I could tell it was unfamiliar to him, that pause, that reconsideration, the space where certainty used to be. The city moved around us in slow return, engines humming, footsteps resuming, conversations picking back up in fragments, but the center of it all remained here, in this stillness we had not quite stepped out of yet. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, not in shame exactly, but in reflection, like he was tracing the line of decisions that led him here and finding places where something could have been different. I understand, he said finally, though his voice carried the weight of someone who knew that understanding after the fact does not change the fact itself, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because I had heard that tone before, in different rooms, in different contexts. The moment when realization arrives too late to prevent what already happened, the light shifted slightly as a cloud moved overhead, softening the sharp reflections off the broken glass. Behind him, and for the first time since this began, the scene felt less tense, not resolved, but quieter, like the energy had changed direction. Hayes took a small step back then, creating a little more distance between us, not as a retreat, but as an adjustment, a recognition of space that had not been there before. His hands settled at his sides, no longer fixed in that earlier posture of control. And I noticed how different he looked now, not in appearance, but in presence, like the uniform no longer carried the same automatic authority it had minutes ago. I will make sure this is documented properly, he said, his words careful, deliberate, and I knew what that meant in his world: reports, statements, procedures that attempt to translate moments like this into something structured, something that can be reviewed. But I also knew that not everything fits into that kind of language. Not everything can be reduced to lines on paper. I glanced once more at the car, at the fractured surface that still caught pieces of the afternoon light, and I thought about how quickly a situation can become something else entirely, how a single moment, a single decision, can carry more weight than anyone expects, not because of what is visible, but because of what it reveals underneath. That is your process, I said quietly, not dismissing, not challenging, just placing his responsibility back where it belonged, and he nodded again, slower now, like he was absorbing more than just the words. The crowd had begun to thin, people drifting away as the tension dissolved into something less defined, their curiosity no longer fueled by conflict but by something harder to capture, something internal. I could feel the heat of the day settling again against my skin, steady, familiar, grounding, and for a moment I simply stood there, breathing, letting the quiet return to its natural rhythm. Hayes shifted his weight once more, then looked past me briefly, as if considering the scene. From a distance, then back again. You handled this with restraint, he said, and there was something genuine in it, something unpolished, and I met his gaze without changing my expression, because restraint is not something you turn on in a moment, it is something you carry, something built over time through experiences that do not leave you the same. It is not restraint, I said softly. It is discipline. And that word settled differently, deeper, because it spoke to something beyond the moment, something that had been shaped long before this street, this car, this interaction. He did not respond immediately, but I saw the way he took that in, the way it shifted something again, and as the last of the crowd dispersed, as the city resumed its steady movement around us, I knew that this moment would not stay here, not fully. Parts of it would follow him, follow me, not as something heavy, but as something clear, something that cannot be unseen once it has been recognized, and in that quiet understanding, I remained standing there, grounded in who I was, not needing to say anything more. Because everything that mattered had already been revealed. The street had almost returned to itself, but something underneath it had not, and I could feel it in the way Officer Hayes lingered just a second longer than protocol required, like he was standing at the edge of a moment he was not ready to leave behind yet, not because of me, not even because of the car, but because of what had shifted inside him. He glanced once more at the fractured windshield, the scattered reflections now softer under the changing light, and then back at me, his posture no longer defined by authority alone but by something more measured, something aware. "There will be a report," he said, but this time it sounded less like procedure and more like acknowledgement, like he understood that this moment deserved to be recorded not just as an incident, but as something that carried weight beyond paperwork. I nodded slightly, not out of agreement, but because I recognized the effort in the statement, the attempt to place order around something that did not begin in order. A passing breeze moved through the street then, lifting the edge of my jacket just enough to remind me that the world does not pause for moments like this. It keeps moving, even when something inside it changes. Hayes hesitated, just briefly, then spoke again. "May I ask something?" And there was a different tone in that question, not authority, not demand, but permission, something that had not existed between us when this began. I considered him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just observing the shift that had taken place. "You may," I said, keeping my voice even, grounded. He nodded once, gathering the question like it mattered. "Why did you not say it sooner?" he asked, and there it was, not defensive, not challenging, just honest, the kind of question that comes after realization, when someone is trying to understand the space between what happened and what could have been different. I let that question settle for a second, feeling its weight. Because it was not as simple as it sounded, it never is. I looked past him briefly, at the road stretching ahead, at the city continuing its quiet rhythm, then back at him. "Because it should not have been necessary," I said, and the words were not sharp, not accusatory, just clear, and that clarity seemed to land deeper than any explanation could. His expression shifted again, more subtle this time, like he was not just hearing the answer but understanding what it pointed to. Something beyond this street, beyond this moment, something rooted in patterns that do not announce themselves but show up anyway. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction more. And I could see it now, the weight of the realization settling fully, not as something overwhelming, but as something that would stay with him, something that could not be undone by moving on to the next call. "I see," he said quietly, and I believed him, not because the situation was resolved, but because the shift was real. The crowd was gone now, the space around us open again, no longer held by curiosity or tension, just another street, another moment in a city that rarely looks back. But we both knew this was not just another moment, not for him, not for me. I adjusted my stance slightly, grounding myself again, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath, the calm that comes after something has fully unfolded. Hayes stepped back another inch, creating just enough distance to signal that whatever this was, it had changed form completely. "Thank you," he said then, and it was not for compliance, not for cooperation, but for something else entirely, something quieter, something harder to define. I met his gaze one last time, not with judgment, not with approval, just with presence, because some moments do not require resolution, they require recognition. And as the light shifted once more across the surface of the car, as the city moved forward without hesitation, I turned slightly, not away from him, but toward what came next, carrying with me the same steadiness I had held from the beginning, knowing that what had happened here would not stay contained in this space, but would follow in ways neither of us could fully predict, quiet, lasting, and impossible to unsee once it had been revealed. The moment did not end with his words, it stretched quietly into something deeper, something neither of us could rush past, and as I turned slightly toward the street ahead, I could feel the weight of what had just unfolded settling into a kind of stillness that did not demand attention but held it anyway. The city had moved on, cars passing, distant conversations blending into a steady hum. But for me the moment lingered in the details, the faint warmth of the sun against my skin, the subtle tension still resting in my shoulders, the reflection of the sky fractured across the windshield behind me. I took a step forward, then another, not hurried, not hesitant, just moving with intention, aware of every part of myself in motion, because walking away from something like this is never just physical, it is internal, it is choosing what you carry and what you leave behind. I heard him shift behind me, not calling out, not stopping me, just adjusting his presence in a space that no longer required his control, and for a second I wondered what this moment would become for him later, when the street was quiet again, when the report was written, when the memory replayed itself without the pressure of the crowd or the urgency of the call, because those are the moments when truth settles the deepest, when there is no audience, no noise, just reflection. I reached the front of the car and paused, my hand hovering just inches from the edge of the glass, not touching it, just acknowledging it. The lines were jagged but still catching the light, still holding form despite what had been done, and I found something in that, something familiar, something that mirrored more than just the surface. I let my hand lower slowly, choosing not to dwell there, not because it did not matter, but because it did not define the whole of what this moment was. I turned back slightly, just enough to see him one last time. He had stepped back toward his cruiser, posture straighter now but not rigid, his hands resting at his sides instead of fixed in command, and when our eyes met again, there was no tension, no resistance, just a quiet understanding that had not existed before. He gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just real, and I returned it with the same simplicity. Because sometimes acknowledgement is the only resolution a moment needs. I stepped around the car then, moving toward the driver's side, the door still open from earlier, the interior unchanged, waiting, steady, like it had not been part of what just happened, and as I settled back into the seat, the leather warm beneath me, the familiar space grounding me again, I paused for just a second before reaching for the wheel, letting the silence inside the car wrap around me, separate from the street, separate from everything outside. It was in that quiet that I felt it fully. Not relief, not even satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that does not come from winning or losing, but from knowing exactly who you are when everything around you tries to define you differently. I started the engine and the sound was smooth, controlled, unchanged, a reminder that not everything is altered by a single moment, even one that feels as heavy as this. I glanced once more through the windshield, the cracks still there, the view slightly distorted but not lost, and I thought about how perspective works like that, how even when something interrupts the way you see the world, it does not take away your ability to move forward through it. I eased the car into motion, slow at first, deliberate, the tires rolling over the pavement with a quiet certainty, and as I passed him, I did not stop, did not speak, not out of dismissal, but because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The truth had already done its work, and as the street opened ahead of me, stretching into the distance under the late afternoon light, I carried with me the same steady rhythm I had held from the beginning, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, because some moments do not change who you are. They reveal it, and once revealed, it stays with you, quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore. I did not look back again after that intersection, not because I was trying to forget what happened, but because I understood something most people never pause long enough to realize, that moments like that are not meant to be carried as weight, they are meant to be carried as clarity. The road ahead stretched wide under the fading gold of the afternoon sun, the city returning to its rhythm like nothing had shifted. But inside me something had settled into place with a quiet certainty that did not need validation. I drove at a steady pace, hands relaxed on the wheel, eyes forward, aware of the faint distortion in the windshield but no longer focused on it, because I knew the crack did not define the view, it only reminded me of what had tried to interrupt it, and as the miles passed, I thought about how easily a person can be reduced in a single glance. How quickly assumptions can build into actions when no one takes the time to see beyond what is visible, not just on the street, but everywhere, in offices, in stores, in conversations where respect is given or withheld before a word is even spoken, and I realized again that what happened back there was not rare, it was simply visible, and visibility has a way of forcing truth into the open, even when people are not ready for it. I stopped at a red light and for a moment everything went still again, the engine humming softly beneath me. The world paused in that brief space between motion and movement, and I caught my reflection faintly in the glass, steady, composed, unchanged in the ways that mattered because who I am was never dependent on who someone else thought I was in a moment of misunderstanding, and that is where the real strength lies, not in proving people wrong, but in never letting their assumptions define your direction. The light turned green and I moved forward without hesitation, because forward is always the only direction that holds purpose, and as I merged back into the flow of traffic, I understood something deeper than before. That dignity is not something you fight for in loud moments, it is something you carry quietly until it becomes undeniable, and that kind of presence has a way of shifting not just situations, but people, even those who never expected to change. Somewhere behind me a siren sounded in the distance, fading quickly as it moved away, and I thought about Officer Hayes, about the way his voice changed, about the space that opened between what he assumed and what he learned. And I knew that moment would stay with him, just as it stayed with me, not as something bitter, not as something to hold against him, but as something that could shape what comes next, because real change does not come from being corrected, it comes from seeing clearly for the first time. I kept driving, the skyline beginning to glow under the early evening light, and I felt something settle fully inside me, not tension, not relief, but alignment, the kind that comes when your actions match your values without hesitation. And if you have ever been in a moment where you felt unseen, underestimated, or judged before you were understood, remember this: your power is not in how loudly you respond, it is in how firmly you stand in your truth until it becomes impossible to ignore. And if this story stayed with you, take a second to share what you would have done in that moment, because sometimes the quietest decisions reveal the strongest kind of character.